We would like to begin this session by acknowledging that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the Weisman Art Museum is located within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. This land acknowledgement is just a first step in the long, complex process of reconciling with the colonial legacy of our institution. With this acknowledgement and our ongoing work with the repatriation of the Mimbres cultural materials, as well as the Truth and Repair project, we affirm our commitment to this process. WAM would like to thank the HRK Foundation and Ameriprise for supporting our operational budget, the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their support for this project, as well as individuals like you who contribute to the annual fund. After our talk tonight, there will be a Q&A session. Before we begin, I want to clarify that the roundtable tonight will not be addressing the repatriation of the Mimbres ancestors and their belongings. Tribal advisors have requested that their privacy be respected while the consultation process for the repatriation is underway. At their request, we have agreed not to speak publicly about this delicate and difficult process. Rather than focusing on the specifics of the ongoing repatriation currently happening at the Weisman, tonight's roundtable will be a broader discussion on the complex issues surrounding the return of cultural artifacts, institutional accountability, and harm reparation with Native communities in the museum field today. I am thankful to my colleagues who are with us tonight, Brian Bayo, Misty Blue, Joseph Aguilar, also known as Woody, so it's hard for me to call him Joseph, and Kat Hayes. You can learn more about each of their backgrounds in tonight's program on your sit. And now, without further ado, we will be beginning our discussion with a short presentation from Joseph Aguilar. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Alejandra, for that nice introduction. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to attempt to do in about 5 minutes or so is kind of add some context to this discussion and talk a little bit about some historical context and talk about the origins of archaeology and how museums are kind of go hand in hand with archaeology as a discipline, and some of the consequences of the development of archaeology and museums for Native people. And I start off with a slide of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, just because it's a classic example of like collecting for collection's sake. So this is a grad seminar on the development of archaeology in 5 minutes. So archaeology has its origins with what's called the speculative period in North America, and this is true for any kind of colonial encounters with indigenous peoples across the world, where usually conquistadors, missionaries, tried their best to figure out exactly who Native people were. It was a speculation. Like for us in North America, it was a question about like whether or not indigenous people were even human beings, and what to make of them. Were they lost tribes of Israel? Like, how do we explain these people who we have no context or understanding for? And so what grew out of speculation of indigenous folks was what is called antiquarianism, where people who were speculating began to gain an interest not in the people or their cultures, but in the things that they produced, and they tended to separate those materials, these cultural materials, from the people themselves, and collected relics, if you will, or objects from those cultures and just amass collections just for the sake of collecting. And these are also known as like cabinets of curiosities. And these existed all over North America and of course in Europe. What followed after that was like a more organized way of kind of understanding materials. Not so much people yet, but materials. And this was based on like classification systems that were borrowed from the natural sciences, such as like the natural sciences would divide the natural world into like kingdoms, right? Like people, plants, so forth. And so they tried to borrow those classification systems and impose them on material culture, which was just a more convenient way for archaeologists to classify things. It really didn't say much about people themselves, but it said a lot about things. Kind of part of this whole debate was this idea of the mound builders, quote unquote mound builders, and a debate arose as to like who built these mounds. And the mounds I'm talking about exist like in southeastern North America up to this area. Thomas Jefferson was one of the first people to do like what we might consider like scientific archaeology in a more methodological way. He posed the questions of like who these people are, and there was some folks on one side who said, yes, these folks are indigenous folks. Others were like, no, they're not indigenous. They can't possibly be. Native people are not smart enough to build these mounds. It must be Egyptians, Chinese, aliens, what have you. And this was a central part of like the development of archaeology in North America. Even Tucker Carlson chimed in on this. And this has real consequences for Native people today because these ideas persist, even though these debates happened like 250 years ago. Okay.
With the population we imagine lived here, extrapolating backward from the Indian nations who were here when we arrived.
Yeah.
That's just not possible.
Right.
So like it had to have looked much different from what we imagine.
Yeah, to me, it's an unresolved mystery. And here's the thing, which is not really politically correct to say anymore, but if you read all the old accounts of the surveyors, the pioneers, the people who talked to the tribes that were living amongst the remains of these giant earthworks, it was invariably the same thing. They didn't build them, someone before them built them.
Well, that's right.
Well,
there's archaeological evidence of that was suppressed by the tribes. I mean, there has been, like, there's skeletal evidence of, with the population we imagine.
So, like, these, and this has real consequences for us as Native people today because it separates us from our own histories in a way that has, like, very real consequences for Native people today. And these ideas persist. You know, in this political climate, you could imagine like the audience that this type of messaging reaches, and the perceptions that are made in people's heads on like, okay, how do we treat Native peoples based on this type of knowledge? Developing from that was a type of archaeology or anthropology that attempted to just that thought that Native cultures were so endangered and at the brink of vanishing that they had to collect as much as they could, not just objects, but like data, like ethnographic data, recordings, any type of writings. And this is known as salvage anthropology. Then we move to a more scientific archaeology, which is practiced today, which tries to use scientific methods to explain culture. All of this to say is that museums, these big museums, the Smithsonian, the Field Museum, Harvard Peabody, Pitt Rivers Museum, any major institution is implicated in these practices because they funded these expeditions to go on these salvage ethnography archaeology trips. They funded archaeological digs across North America. And where do these things end up? The things that they collected from our communities, they end up in museums. And they're still there to this day. And what Native folks are trying to reckon with is how do we one, like, just come to grips with like the sheer amount of materials of cultural patrimony that's out there, and how do we reckon with it? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with the delicate questions about repatriation or stewardship of materials in these museums? And so part of that response is movements within archaeology, like indigenous archaeology, which is really a way that indigenous folks have really taken archaeology and transformed it and made it useful and beneficial to themselves based on their own value systems, ways of understanding the world, and just making archaeology work for them while trying to remedy these like colonial legacies of archaeology and museums. And that's my presentation.
Oh, next. No, I don't need a slide or anything. I'm going to just read, because as my students know, if you let me go off script, then I'm reading from a script, because as my students know, if I go off script, forget it. I'm going to just be off on a tangent here. So, and I have a lot of opinions on this topic. I'd like to address some of the truths that have to be confronted before collecting institutions, and particularly universities, are going to be able to engage in repair. These involve how knowledge is produced, but also transformed into a kind of possession, which makes it difficult to recognize and redress the nature of its extraction. I've been thinking about this most with respect to physical collections, items accumulating in the possession of museums or academic units. But the process could equally be observed with intangible or derivative collections like data, documentation, ideas, arts, practices, and so on. And here I'm drawing some inspiration from the work of a colleague formerly in the political science department here, Robert Nichols, who wrote about land dispossession. In his recent book, Theft is Property, he describes settler land accumulation as a form of recursive dispossession, in which land is not only taken from indigenous nations, but is transformed into property, while constraining native peoples such that they could only sell and never reacquire land. The property relation, which gives exclusive rights of access, is fundamentally at odds with indigenous forms of land relationality, and every time land as property changes hands, its potential to return to that state of relation is rejected anew. I think that this is an apt description of the dispossession process that happens with physical collections, such as what he was just talking about, which have been acquired without consent from those who maintain cultural and historical relations with them. Once incorporated into collecting institutions, those items or object beings become prohibitively difficult to restore for a variety of reasons. In the case of universities and museums, public or otherwise, one of the rhetorical forms of dispossession, ironically, comes from declaring collections and knowledge production as a benefit to all. Academic freedom is premised on this. If we do not constrain the choice of research focus, we will most likely have knowledge produced which encompasses the broadest perspectives. But this presumes that there are no constraints on who becomes a researcher or a museum professional directing acquisitions. In fact, collections and academic knowledge production are in the hands of very few. And the barriers to entry are actually getting worse, despite decades of efforts to make universities more representative. This means that a relative few researchers are able to justify their own research questions as having universal benefits, most often without ever consulting with those who are most impacted or whose ancestors or cultural materials are collected. The recursive nature of this dispossession then proceeds when researchers maintain possession of extracted materials, but they do not nurture them. By that I mean those items are treated as alienated objects. Careless treatment often results in loss of documentation, or items which derive their meaning from their related assemblage are separated. Then researchers or museums trade items without documentation. The process is compounded when academic departments realize generations later that they possess items without related records and decide to use them for teaching. And often students take away the idea that such collections are less worth our care. And in some instances, academic researchers transfer items or collections to museums, which only value their formal qualities rather than their associations. At each turn, items get further from home, more alienated. At each step, the path to reassociation takes more work, which the institution regards as unnecessary. I don't wish to give the impression that academic freedom and teaching are not valued. Indeed, academic freedom allows me to speak critically of this institution that I work for, and teaching is our best route for instilling different values. I would like to suggest, however, that repair needs to start with a changing sense of the other side of the freedom coin, which is responsibility. There's actually a clause on responsibility in our university's policy. It's very short, which has vague language on professional duties and not speaking on behalf of the university on matters of public interest. So I will not speak on behalf of the institution, but rather to the institution, the university. What is the institution's responsibility to repair the harms of previous generations? Should it not be part of our professional duties to restore the ancestors, the belongings, and the knowledge to the places and people who our predecessors took them from? When we can all acknowledge that both researchers and the institution benefited from these extractive practices, I believe it is the university's responsibility to channel that benefit back into the process of care, repair, reassociation, and return. And I know that my colleague, Misty Blue, will have much more to say about this. Thank you.
Bonjour. My name is Misty Blue. I am a member of the White Earth Nation and have descendancy through Lower Sioux. I'm coming at this conversation from maybe a different angle. I was appointed by the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and that is a state entity comprised of representation from all 11 tribes. That's a state entity that is comprised of representation from all 11 tribes and state commissioners to be in communication with each other. I was the coordinator for the Truth Project, the Towards Recognition in University Tribal Healing Project, and we partnered with the Office of Native Affairs at the University of Minnesota to do a full accounting of tribal university relations, or at least open a conversation. So tribal university relations obviously goes back 170 years, so we really just tried to open up the conversation and begin to understand what has been taken. So the origins for our project come from the land grab article published in High Country News, where all of the land that was taken through the Morrill Act was mapped out, and it was associated with the tribal nations and associated with the amounts that were paid for those lands. In that effort to open that conversation, we realized really quickly that it was not just about land that was grabbed, it was also about knowledge and spirituality and cultural objects and human remains over time. So basically, we really endeavored to sort of wrestle away the microphone from folks like Tucker, right, and to really start to tell this story from the voice of the tribes and the Native people here who are still here. Unfortunately, our project cannot cannot yet encompass those who still remain exiled, so that's more work to be done there. But we were able to find and map 186,000 acres to date, and a part of that really has been trying to also reconcile the resolution that was made by MARKK in the summer of 2020, where it called on the university to repatriate American Indian human remains and funerary objects. So our project really started in because of that resolution that was made. I think when we think about what we learned and what we think about next steps, we have a couple that we have been hearing over and over from the tribes, that this work and this accounting and this repair really must be done in partnerships with partnership with tribes, and it must center Native voices, and there's prime opportunity to work with the TIPOs of each tribal nation. That's a great starting point. We heard that it's really important to share power and experiment with shared governance models, that any repatriation efforts really need to be large-scale, high-volume efforts, and that's really to account for the 170 years of grabbing and of taking, that we actually have to put dedicated resources, dedicated staff, because all throughout the years there was researchers over time who were grabbing and taking, and they're still within the archives and the personal collections of professors and others affiliated with the university. Also, we heard that there's opportunity to partner with tribes and with TIPOs, and some of that could look like training or developing technologies where tribes themselves can preserve their own cultural heritage and not have to have those artifacts held on campus. And then we also heard that these efforts really need to go beyond NAGPRA, like library archives need to be considered as well, and that the personal collections of professors should also be considered as well. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Brian Vallo, and I'm from Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. And I just want to say that I've been doing this work for quite some time, over 30 years, really since the enactment of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was during this time that I was serving as the lieutenant governor of my community, and really opened my eyes to, for the first time, to the policies and the problems around repatriation that really generated this career for me. And it isn't easy work. It's really, at its core, just very heartbreaking. The image on the screen is of Mesa Verde, or in our language we call Kashkacht. And many of the people who built these incredible places, my ancestors, unfortunately were unearthed from these places, and many of them live in institutions just like this one. Their migration took them to north central New Mexico, to a place called Chaco Canyon. Here again, incredible architecture and incredible life was lived by our ancestors in preparation for their migration to their present-day settlements, including my homeland of Acoma. But it was at these places, including Chaco, and this is a photo of Pueblo Bonito, one of the larger structures and villages in the canyon, where our ancestors and their funerary materials and all, if not all of their material culture, were excavated and brought to institutions throughout the world. So it's this practice, as Woody mentioned earlier, and this history of archaeology and anthropology that have put Native people in this time in a very difficult situation of addressing the problems, addressing the issues, and really educating ourselves about policies, the very few that exist that are mandated by the United States Congress, in some cases mandated by states, and in some cases, and more recently, mandated by tribes themselves, to return, to repatriate ancestors and their funerary materials back to our communities. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act just underwent a thorough review and revision. And we're hopeful that as a result of this action, that there will be more resources provided to tribes throughout the country to be more active in this work. Many people don't realize the costs associated with repatriation. Some recognize that there's a process in place. Oftentimes the process doesn't exist because a lot of institutions maybe have not thought that far ahead and have maybe continued to conduct their work in a way in which a box or boxes are checked and not necessarily digging deeper, and excuse that pun, to understand the communities, understand our own tribal laws and processes for this work. And because we maybe lack some capacity at home in terms of having our own archaeologists and anthropologists, attorneys, and other experts, we oftentimes have to contract these services and pay for these services, which can be quite costly. And one of the reasons why the NAGPRA law was revised was because of this, that there were not enough resources from the federal government to support this work. And tribes are strained, really, because there are collections of our ancestors that exist all over the world. And it's almost impossible to even fathom the thought of, in a certain period of time, how many of those ancestors will we actually bring home? Will we actually reinter at those places where they were taken from? Just recently, I gave a talk at the MARKK Museum, and I mentioned that, as a result of the mandate of NAGPRA of institutions to provide inventories of ancestors and their associated materials and other material culture taken from sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco. By the time I left my pueblo, serving as the director of the Historic Preservation Office, we were looking at well over 130,000 items for my tribe only. And it included all of those categories. So you can imagine that when we think about this work and engaged in this work, we almost have to prioritize the collections. And it's done in a way that is considers the needs of our culture as they exist today. This is an image of the original exhibit at the Field Museum, which recently underwent a major overhaul, thankfully. But this is an institution that also has a history of and a vast collection of Pueblo ancestors and associated materials. But it's an institution like this who has actually stepped forward to bring together Native experts, cultural consultants, cultural leaders, tribal leaders, to help them formulate a process for consultation, more meaningful consultation with tribes, in hopes of repatriating more of these items back to communities. This is my community of Acoma. It's our present day community. It's where our culture and all of our social activities take place. It's our central homeland. And everything that we repatriate comes back to this place. Ancestral human remains don't necessarily come back to the village, but they are reburied in areas that cultural leaders identify as appropriate spaces for them. Tribal communities have also established tribal museums, including my tribe. For the purpose of repatriating, there are spaces in some of our tribal museums that are designed to accommodate collections that are repatriated. Some filter through these institutions for the purpose of documentation. And in some cases, where cultural patrimony is concerned, items will come here to be stewarded by our own people who work in these institutions. But we can't do all of this by ourselves. We certainly don't take any real level of responsibility for the actions of our white father, as one of our former governors would reference. But we do what we can to ensure that we have processes in place that will enable this work to continue. Because there will be generations of Acoma people and other Native people who will still be doing the work that I've been doing for the past 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts tonight. So I'm going to start with some questions while we get other questions from the audience that come in. And I wanted to ask this panel, and whoever wants to take the question is welcome, what does truth and repair imply to you?
Big question.
Yeah.
To me, I think a starting place is acknowledgement, that you have to admit that something is awry, right? You have to acknowledge it and own it. But the problem is that most institutions, most museums aren't even willing to do that. Sometimes they'll engage in the work of repatriation without even acknowledging their histories, the histories of their institutions, because to do so would be to admit that they're implicated in the practices of colonialism and all the kind of bad practices of archaeology that I talked about. So I think a starting place would be to own it and acknowledge that, yes, we're implied in these histories.
Misty?
I think I have a similar answer. Is this okay? I think oftentimes we're very mystified as to how does settler colonialism happen. Like, we're very mystified to, like, you know, how does one have privilege and another, you know, not have privilege, and so and those are really fueled by those revisionist narratives like land-grant university. So when we really start to do that full accounting and that full truth-telling, we have to be able to really say what happened, right? I think for a lot of Native folks, like, we feel it viscerally, and we say, like, we feel it like, oh yeah, we know genocide happened here, and we know the university was complicit in that. But how are we able to express that with all the emotion that it comes along with it, and have, you know, others kind of walk with us through that?
Yeah, I mentioned the Field Museum in my brief presentation, and the rehabilitated Native Hall there. The title of the exhibit is Native Truths, Our Voices, Our Stories. And one of the things I think that is important here when we think about the truths is that the truths have to be spoken from the perspective of the people represented in these collections. And so while there's this problem at the Field Museum around repatriation, we also found this as an opportunity to really demand that we needed to have access to the space, to the collections, to the various departments within the institution, and to the leadership of the institution, so that we might together, on some level, and it's a process, arrive at some truths. Repatriation is one piece of this larger picture. And so we need to be included. We need to have access. We need to be provided opportunities to engage in the curation of exhibitions, revisiting narratives that are erroneous and really rooted in a colonial concept and understanding. And so I'm hopeful that as we continue this work together, that the truths will speak for themselves, that the truths will open doors, and that the truths will ensure that Native people have a place in these institutions and in the world of the arts. So, yeah, thank you.
Just following along from what my wise colleagues are saying here, one of the things that I've often thought about in this process is there's a way that you can proceed forward, even with truths and into the repair process of, let's just say, repatriation, that does not fundamentally get at. There's sort of a superficial level that we can approach this. And I think that a lot of times institutions sort of stop there. And in particular, I want to think about the way that, again, dispossession happens by turning belongings into objects. And institutional responses to repatriation, which are, often prompted by their legal peril, let's be honest, means that they approach the return process as one in which they do the return and then they feel like our hands are clean now. We're done. It's entirely a transactional sort of approach to repatriation, and that in no way is that reparative. Because for better or for worse, one of the truths that institutions really do need to acknowledge is that you've engendered a relationship that requires ongoing care, right? There is no actual way to effect repair by simply returning. You need to also understand that you have an ongoing relationship that is part of that restorative process. So I think, in a lot of ways, Brian, particularly to your point, that the process cannot be directed by the institutions themselves. It has to be, and I think this is what scares institutions the most, is that it requires giving away authority, right? Acknowledging that you don't and you should not have it in this relationship, that you don't drive it, you follow. And that's the piece that I think we need to learn to listen more and not sort of direct. That's hard for especially for universities to do a lot.
I think that, that is one of the main reasons why we have a panel like this. And we've talked a lot about this among ourselves, and about the fact that to us, as also a museum, the repatriation is just the beginning of something, and we don't want this to be the end. It is just a way in which we're trying to have a cleaner start in our relationship with the indigenous communities. And there is a question here that I really appreciate that I am going to read to you because it's something that I confront all the time because, as being the lead of this repatriation and the director of this museum, I get a lot of comments from people and what their opinions are. So the question is, how can Native nations and allies contend with a narrative within academia that remains and artifacts should be studied? Oh, and now it moved because, should be studied and kept to help humanity. And there is this sense of ownership in institutions and in people that were behind these histories where they feel that they have a hand up in this and they have a say in what is not theirs. So could you address this question?
So I think my initial reaction is that building collective power and collective voice, that, like our moderator said, or Kat said, institutions will never just simply relinquish their power, right? We really need to be putting that pressure on them, and we do that collectively. And I also think that the idea that these pieces of cultural heritage should be kept is fair, but by whom? And who should protect those? That's actually the responsibility and the honor of the Native nations themselves, and not from the institution.
This is one of those complex issues that I hope gets resolved at some point. But to be honest, in the work that some of us have been engaged over the years, this is one of those questions and one of the issues that remains unresolved and isn't understood. When tribes come forward and insist that any further research or study, especially anything invasive, must stop, and that those items, especially ancestral human remains and their funerary items, be protected until such time they can return. This is something that is still very difficult for institutions to understand and accept. Now, the other problem is that not all tribes in this country and some of our Pueblo communities in New Mexico will not repatriate, will not bring back their ancestors and or cultural materials, because in their own cultural value systems dictate that they have, because they have left and have been exposed beyond their communities that they are part of, that it might create challenges for the community if these things came back. So that means these institutions remain stewards of this collection. And if tribes are saying, you have to take care of them, bring us to the table so we can discuss how you care for them, but you still do not have and should not have any access to these items for research and study. So I think this is an ongoing conversation that is being had by tribes and institutions. It's also not only in the United States, but internationally. It's also a conversation that is being had between tribes and the federal government.
Yeah, and I think the question of, or the idea that universities, museums, and other maybe research institutions are there to serve humanity at large, it really assumes that these places have the intellectual high ground, right? Where how dare you challenge our take on the world and please let us continue to use your cultural patrimony as our research specimens. That it assumes so much, but what of the ethical and like moral grounds for continuing to engage in really destructive practices? Like what of that, right? Like what of that high ground? It seems to be, there seems to be less consideration of ethics and morals when you place kind of intellectual kind of endeavors over all else. And when tribes question those motives of universities, museums, research institutions, it assumes that like tribes are against progress or against science or anti-science, when that is not the case at all. We're making moral and ethical arguments against museums, not to inhibit science, but to really ask these places to question like their own practices. And yeah, and I think that questioning only, to me, really enriches science and our philosophies of like how we understand the world, like epistemologically. It has a lot to offer when you pose these questions rather than kind of holding them back.
I'll just add that the narrative that's out there that is so pervasive, again, just to reemphasize, you know, the number of people who are setting that research agenda that apparently is relevant to all humanity is very small. There isn't an open process of saying like, hey, do y'all think this is a good research question? That's not the way it works, right? So, you know, if we take it in that perspective to say, who is deciding on behalf of all humanity that this is a legitimate research question that needs to move forward, and that somebody needs to, not me, but somebody needs to sacrifice their grandmother's remains for that research project. You know, I think if you did open it up to that question, that they would not get the answer they wanted.
So there's also an interesting question here, more thinking of we are not going to be here one day, and how, what message, advice, or words of encouragement would you have for the youth that will be continuing this work?
Just yesterday, I gave a keynote address to a group of Native people, Pueblo people who work in historic preservation, who are doing all that they can to preserve their built environment within their respective communities, but also preserving ancestral structures. And one of the questions that I posed to them was, I actually posed several questions. I think there were like 20 questions that I posed to the group. But there were some that were focused on what are you doing and what can we be doing in this time to recruit, to ensure that we're continuously building our capacity at the tribal level. And how does this work? Because historic preservation has two sides, right? There's this kind of Western thought about what preservation is, and then there's based on traditional knowledge, native knowledge, there's also this idea of preserving and protecting. So the work that we're doing in preservation, how is that contributing to safeguarding our languages and our culture? Because one of the things that I fear, and as a reality, is that we are losing our languages, our own indigenous languages. Currently, we're able to consult with cultural leaders, healers, and other experts within our communities to understand collections, to understand the places that, including the two of the images that I shared tonight, and understand that history, and it's conveyed to us in our language. But when we have such severe language loss, when the next generation of people in Acoma can no longer speak their language, how is that information passed down? And how powerful will that information be? Because in the government's eye, they might see us just like anyone else. And it might be an even greater challenge in the future to fulfill some of these federal mandates that require us to really we're in a position of the burden of proof, proving that these items, these ancestors are, in fact, related to us. So there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many things that are in play all at the same time in this time. And I just, we pray, we have ceremony, we do all that we can to sustain our culture. But we are also dealing with the reality that the Western world has a significant impact on the way in which we live.
I think for me, we're in a moment of collective reckoning, right? So we're really sitting with a lot of institutions, especially here. Like we're trying to understand the ways that these institutions have been places and sites of harm, and how do we move towards sites of healing, right? I think that when we think about the harm, the displacement, the loss of connection to land, for example, like those are major traumas, and that really affects and comes through generationally. And trauma really asks us to forget, so that it does become that mystified, like what happened, right? I think a piece of the healing and that hope that my generation's doing and future generations are gonna do is that collective remembering. To remember what happened, to know what happened, so that we can prevent these major, we can prevent violence, we can prevent harm in the future. And to also approach this work in an embodied way, a full way of wholeness, not just with our mind, but with mind, body, spirit, and emotion.
Yeah, and just like Brian mentioned, like the reality of life in our communities, in our Native communities across the country, is difficult, right? And we, as three Indigenous persons representing our communities, we're just a small part of this larger project, and I'm really optimistic about our engagement within these fields moving forward, within archaeology, anthropology, and museums, because we have so many colleagues, right, Brian, like engaged in the discipline across the country. Native people are becoming archaeologists, they're becoming PhDs in anthropology, they're teaching at universities, they're becoming curators, they're becoming lawyers, and they're really challenging the status quo. And I think that is just going to continue to grow. Like in my role, I try to mentor students to engage in the field. And it just takes a couple here and there, a few there, to infiltrate these spaces and ways of thinking to create big change. And I for one am like really optimistic about like the future of this work.
So I can only speak to this from the inside the belly of the beast, right? The university, but you know, I am part of this program within the university called Heritage Studies and Public History, and one of the challenges that I see in doing this work, I mean, first of all, we have the most amazing students. And they are going to, you know, contribute to changing this field, and I'm so excited about that. But it's also, you know, the challenge in instructing in that program is, again, to resist the urge to, for me to place myself as like, I'm going to teach you how to do this, because I don't want my students to replicate the field as it exists today. I want them to change it. And so it is as much a process for me of learning from my students as to the direction that these professions can go in, and then maybe offering them some strategies for opening those spaces up for themselves once they get their feet into those institutions. You know, to not sort of say like, this is the way that you become this professional, but to say like, what is the professional that you want to be, and let's figure out ways to help you do that, right, to change those spaces.
Brian, yeah.
Alejandro, thank you. I just wanted to add that there are two other, I think, aspects to, or not aspects, but components to this work that is really evolving at a rapid pace, and that is the advocacy of Native people, you know, the Land Back, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement, the Protection of Sacred Places movement, women's rights, and you know, it's just really, there's a lot happening, and that voice is so important as well to moving the needle a bit here in the work that we do. But it's also a process of educating the public. Sometimes not from a traditional way of, you know, sharing information, but it's more mainstream, and the good thing about that is that more people gravitate towards that. More younger people, non-Native people, are gravitating towards that. The other component is the contemporary Native arts movement, and all that is doing to educate and inform and to influence change in our institutions, but also in the world of collecting. Because there's this other problem that still exists and that we have yet to realize, that some of the outcomes is that many of these collectors who maybe were involved in some of these excavations also pulled things aside for themselves, and they have these in their own private collections. Yeah. And are now looking for institutions to hand off these items because their heirs do not wish to maintain these collections. So, you know, there's a lot here that I think can, you know, generate more meaningful dialogue, not only in terms of academia, but also the practice, and also at the tribal level. And so I think that there's a great opportunity here to come together and really make some meaningful change in this work and in the thinking and the practices.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that there's something really important in what you mentioned about the private collectors, and because they always also find loops in the law to not repatriate, and we've encountered that in what we do. And you know, just from the museum perspective, I think that we have to learn to listen. For a long time, we've just been talking, and very often just talking to our peers. So in the museum, there needs to be more representation, and we have to have a wider perspective on things, and maybe things like this wouldn't happen or things would change, hopefully. But I feel there's a change. There's a question for Misty that has a lot of votes. Yes, and it says that you mentioned there are objects in the personal collections of university professors. And is there documentation of who has what, and is that public record?
I think that has to be part of that full accounting that the institution does. Our project didn't have the capacity to do that, but we know that from what tribes are saying that it is an issue. I think anecdotally, tribes know that there are, that professors do have that, and even like students would know that when professors are using them in their classroom, for example, right? So I've talked to 11 out of 11 tribes here in Minnesota. I've also talked to 11 out of 12 tribes in Michigan, and those themes were coming up, anecdotally. But no, not public record yet, and I think there's more work to be done there.
Thank you. There's a question here also that is related to something that has been argued when it comes to the Mimbres collection and the lack of descendants, right? So it says here, who takes the lead in decision-making for those items from Native peoples who have no identifiable descendants? Yeah, Brian, go for it.
That issue is handled in different ways throughout the country. In the Southwest, the 19 Pueblo tribes of New Mexico have an understanding that collections of Mimbres or ancestors that are unidentified, that there is a group of Pueblo representatives who have been identified to address those issues and those collections of the unidentified ancestors. And so these Pueblo groups work together to do a little research of their own and provide information back to the Pueblo leadership. Now, oftentimes there will be still a claim made by Pueblo people for those unidentified based on the documentation that exists about location of the excavation and whatever associated documentation might be available. And those tribes will come together and agree to go ahead and make a claim for repatriation. And then the process would continue just as it does for any other repatriation claim where there's consultation, there is a visitation with those collections, review of collections, and then the eventual return and reinterment of those ancestors that unfortunately are unidentified.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think the question of affiliation, when we're talking about museum collections or people from the past, has been used as a tool by the federal government and universities that allows them to disassociate people from the past with those descendant communities, contemporary descendant communities. It's kind of deceptive tool, and these terms are used in ways to make those disassociations that justifies the ongoing use of these cultural materials in ways that maybe aren't appropriate in our eyes. And so part of, I think, what we all try to do here is kind of break down those lines, those divides, those artificial, arbitrary lines that have been drawn by anthropologists and museums to say that, oh, these people are not affiliated with anybody, therefore we can do X, Y, Z. We try to erase those lines and kind of break down that divide between history and prehistory and ancestral people and contemporary people, and when it comes to indigenous people, because they're our ancestors, like regardless of what any archaeologist or anthropologist says. And you can't just pull out a term and say like it's unaffiliated, so it must be. You always have to question these terms that are used.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could just take the term of unaffiliated and replace it with not yet affiliated, or, you know, because in a way the unaffiliated terminology to institutions often indicates that they can stop. They can stop doing the work. You know, it's done. We've done our duty, and we can step away from it and do whatever we need to. But, you know, in my experience doing any of this kind of work from inside the institution, it's, you know, it may seem like there's nothing that you can go on, but, you know, again, this is the whole point of consultation within the NAGPRA process, is you just haven't talked to enough people yet, or you haven't, you know, gone and found the documentation yet that will help you to reassociate. And that disassociation process is the fault of the archaeologists, the museums, the institutions themselves. So it's our obligation to continue to do that work. And I will say that the institution does not support it, right? Like, they'll say that they support it, but you know, that in theory, right? But to what extent is it considered to be part of our job to do that work? It's not. It's really sort of considered to be sort of an add-on to that. But you know, we should never be stopping with that sort of sense of like, oh, you know, there's no descendants of these people. It's like, that's ridiculous. It's just on its face ridiculous.
I don't know if I have much to add, except just I'm mostly struck by like how sad that is overall. And I think in those moments where we don't really know what to do, in our practice, we visit with elders, we go back to community, we ask the collective.
Thank you. There's an interesting question here about more related to resources. So it says, is there any policy work happening that would allocate federal funds to Native communities to remove the financial burden cost of repatriation? So, you know, I just want to say that in the case of this repatriation of the Mimbres, the university is covering the full cost of the consultation process, which is long, and then the repatriation. But if you want to say something else about this question.
So part of our truth project that we did a forensic accounting. So we went back into the land, or we determined the amount of the value of the land and how much wealth it has accumulated over time. And one of those funding streams that we found was the Permanent University Fund that is still in existence, right? So when those lands were sold, they were put onto the books through the Permanent University Fund, and they must be kept there in perpetuity. And so one of our recommendations in the Truth Project is to have reparations in perpetuity, and that is one mechanism that can be diverted to indigenous communities going forward. That is something that the Minnesota legislature could do if it has enough support and willpower from folks like you. But that it would be a way to start that reparations and that repatriation.
The National Park Service manages the NAGPRA program, and There are grants that are awarded to tribes who file for the designation as a tribal historic preservation office. And so those tribes have access to some funding to support their work around repatriation. However, the actual process of repatriation, for the most part, is financed by by the tribe, but by the institution. The institutions really have the responsibility to step forward with the resources to conduct consultation, to accommodate visitation, and all costs associated with packaging and shipping, and the return of the ancestors and other materials back to the tribal community. But their responsibility doesn't end there, and in some cases we've had some great success with institutions where they have paid for the process of digging the grave sites, coordinating with either the state or perhaps the national park that now manages these sites. And they bear the costs for making all of the arrangements for the reburial. Some institutions will even go so far as to provide stipends to the participating tribal members who are conducting the reburial, providing food and lodging and costs for transportation, and other expenses that are incurred by the tribes in preparation for those reburials. Now, tribes also bear a great cost in their advocacy at the federal level, lobbying Congress to ensure that funding is provided for the review of the NAGPRA law. Lobbying Congress and other federal officials to ensure that there are processes in place for the implementation of these laws. There is a new law called the STOP Act, the Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act, which was signed by the president just last year. And we are now in the process of developing the implementation plan for that law, which is really designed to address the problem of illegal trafficking of cultural patrimony. And many tribes who are engaged in this work are bearing the costs for attorney fees, time spent by tribal leaders and others at home who are involved in assisting the federal government with developing those processes. There are many players, and unfortunately we see, not unfortunately, but fortunately, we are seeing that the philanthropic community is also stepping forward, supporting these types of initiatives as well.
So there's another question here. It says, we are here as an audience acknowledging some of the truths of what's happening and has happened. How can we as an audience move towards repair? So pretty much what's next and what could other people do to help?
Well, one thing you could do when you encounter teaching collections in your classes or when you go to a museum on campus, ask rude questions about where these things came from, right? There's, and in any museum context as well, that if the demand for transparency becomes unceasing, then institutions are forced to respond. And so even if you feel like, oh, I've just asked one question, if it's the 25th question that day, it's gonna add up and make an impact. So, even just on that small level of making your voice and your attention known in that context to know that it is not okay. I mean, we could think about on campus here, student action around the medical school basically moved the medical school. They had been sort of, well, I don't know if we should do this or not, but really moved the needle in making the medical school put a moratorium on the use of any human remains for teaching purposes that did not meet the highest standard of consent. And so that means that there are a lot of remains in their possession, which were, we call these legacy collections, right? We don't know what to do with these, so we'll use them for teaching purposes, have now been removed from that role. And again, it was student action that did that. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and I think simply by being here, you guys are already at a good starting point. And there's always, you can always learn, right? Every day you learn something new. Today I went to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, Brian and I, and we saw this awesome photography exhibit, and I learned so much just by engaging with the photographs that were in the galleries, because Native people have a lot to say, and we say it in so many ways. I know right now we're talking about museums and repatriation, but we're not like a one-issue people. There's so much going on in Indian country today, and these conversations, these very difficult conversations that we're having tonight, are happening by Indian educators, by lawyers, by people who practice medicine. We're dealing with these legacies of colonialism in every aspect of our daily lives. And if you, as a general public, or people out in the world, just have an awareness of that. And when you encounter Native people, or you have a chance to encounter Native people or learn more, just take advantage of the opportunity. We have so much at our hands, right? Like, so much information is at our disposal. It's ridiculous. So yeah, I would just encourage people to keep an open mind.
My answer is very similar, just amplify Native voices. I think we're combating those revisionist narratives, and I think it will take all of us to start telling a new story.
Yeah, I echo the words that have already been shared, and for those of you who live here, get to know your tribal communities here. Visit their communities if they are open to the public. Visit the museums when they have Native art shows. Come to hear Native people speak about their art. Meet the Native employees and the curators, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the attorneys, the law students. Get to know your Native people who are around you. And also stay on top of the issues, as Woody said. We are contributors in many ways to the economy of this country, to the development of policy. We're some of the best stewards of land and resources. We have expertise on many issues. And even while we are confined to reservations, some of us, and don't have full access to our ancestral or Aboriginal landholdings, where we have significant sacred places that are essential to our own survival, we still do what we can to ensure that the world is in balance, that everybody is okay.
Thank you. There's a question here that talks more about if you could talk about an example of a relationship being restored in the returning of a relative, or remains or associated objects via MARKK. Could you think of an example where this has happened?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak of any personal example, but what I will say is that when returns happen, especially with ancestral remains or our ancestors, the work is like really delicate, and it's culturally specific, and each person involved has a unique set of experiences with repatriation and the work that we do. And even if I were familiar with the case, I couldn't speak to it because I would not have been involved in it, and I don't have the kind of insight to those really delicate processes that happen to make a repatriation happen. And just keep in mind that like it's delicate work, it's personal work, it's intimate work. There's a ton of emotional labor involved in all of this. And it's culturally specific, and it's done in culturally appropriate ways. And I can't really speak to other people's experiences with this type of work. I can only speak to my own. And quite frankly, I'm not too sure if I would want to share that, you know? It's a very personal experience.
Yeah.
With the enactment of the NAGPRA, there were many mandates, and we as tribes were expected to be a player, to be engaged in the work immediately. For my tribe and many tribes in New Mexico, none of us had a process for reburial of our ancestors. And so we had to think about that, and we had to have very difficult conversations about what that would involve. And then those very intimate conversations were heavy, so much emotion and anger, but we arrived at a process that has been evolving as we've been engaged in this work. And while I won't speak to any specific repatriation, and I've been involved in many, part of that healing begins when you have access. When you first engage with the ancestors, and maybe not touching them or seeing them, but being with them in their space, wherever they happen to be, and telling them why you're there, explaining why you're there, introducing yourself to them, asking them that no harm is brought upon you or your community or your loved ones, or even the people who are handling them daily or caring for them in an institution. That for me is part of the healing, and it begins on that first occasion. Like I said earlier, our future generations of my people are going to continue to do this work, and we let the ancestors know that, because in my lifetime some of these ancestors may not return, and it will be those generations of Acoma people who are going to do this work who might bring them home. So, I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. There are other questions, which is just really exciting to think that there's so much interest in this subject. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for coming, sharing, and learning about this, listening to our friends. And thank you very much to all of you for being here.